Well, welcome everyone. It was great to have the whole band with us, wasn't it? That's good. And we thank you for joining us today. And I'm going to start out talking about my shirt. This is one of my favorite shirts. Maureen got it for me around 25 years ago. And I wear it, and because I do, I know this shirt. I mean, I think we all agree that I know more about this shirt than anyone else, right? Because I'm the one who wears it. Well, how could I know this shirt more? I mean, what would it take? Well, suppose I was the one who made it. I stitched the yarn and I put on the buttons and folded out the creases. I mean, if I made this shirt, then I would know it even more, right? But suppose I wanted to know it even more than that. What would I have to do? I would have to become the shirt. I would have to know what it was like to hang in the closet, a dark closet for long periods of time. And then when it gets put on, it gets stretched and pulled, and I'd have to know what it's like to be worn and that sweat that comes out and the body odor and all that stuff I'd have to absorb. And then I get thrown into the washing machine. I mean, can you imagine how much fun that would be? All the way around with soapy water. And that wouldn't be so bad, but the spin cycle, woo, 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 woo. I don't think it'd be anything like Six Flags. And then I'd be taken out of the closet when I was put on, and I'd be stretched and worn. I'd be back and forth. But if I became the shirt, then I would know this shirt in a completely different way, right? Now consider, God knows us. He kind of sees us on the outside. He sees who we are. He's with us. But not only that, He made us. And because of that, God would certainly know us better than any doctor or any scientist could ever know us. But He did more than that. God, the Word, became human. He became us. It's an amazing story. And that's how John begins his gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him, and without Him nothing was made that was made. In Him was life, and the life was the light of men. He was in the world, and the world was made through Him, and the world did not know Him. But as many as received Him, He gave them the right to become children of God. To those who believe in His name, who were born not of blood, nor the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld His glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And of His fullness we have received grace for grace. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, He has declared Him. Now, this is making an astonishing claim that God came to this earth in the flesh. And that's really astonishing that John would begin his gospel by making that claim and making it so clearly. And in the Gospel of John, Jesus teaches us that this is quite valid, that he is in fact God the Word. And in chapter 5 of John, he gives us four explanations, four testimonies of reasons why people can believe this claim. So he begins, by saying that you just can't take my word for it. The fact is that many religions exist because of the word of one person. And Jesus said it's not just enough to take my word for it. He said that if I only bear witness of myself, if I only testify of myself, then that witness isn't any good. Now, let's pause for a moment. And this word translated witness and sometimes translated testimony is the Greek word martus. This word means, when it's translated witness, that someone saw something happen and they witnessed, they told about what they saw. When this word is translated testimony, it is because they know something, they have seen something in their heart that they know is true, and they testify, they speak of the truth they know is so. Now, this word martos would be where you would speak what you know is true, even if it resulted in death. So we find the early followers of Jesus who witnessed and testified of Jesus would do so even to the point that they would die. And this word martus comes to us in English as the English word martyr. And we see this in this passage from Revelation. They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, their witness, their martus. And they did not love their life even to the death. And so with this, Jesus says it's not enough for just me to testify or witness. Others need to do it. And Jesus calls on 4 witnesses to do that. The first is the witness of John the Baptist. Jesus makes it clear that his claims are not based upon the testimony of a man. But nonetheless, what John the Baptist has to say really adds validity to the claims of Jesus. Because in Jesus' time, John the Baptist was recognized as a prophet. Now, the religious elite might have rejected him, but the devoutly religious and the masses of people saw that John the Baptist was a prophet. And this prophet's testimony of Jesus carries a tremendous amount of weight. Now, next week, I will be talking about the testimony of John the Baptist. But this week, let's just say that this carried a tremendous amount of weight in his day. It was a valid testimony. Jesus claimed that John claimed that Jesus was the Messiah. So we have the testimony of John the Baptizer. Next, we have the testimony of the works of Jesus. And Jesus' works consisted of 2 things, his teaching and his healing ministry. And regarding his teaching, even people who don't believe in God will acknowledge that the teachings of Jesus are extraordinary, really quite amazing. But his testimony was more than just what he taught, it was what he did. It was the works of Jesus. Jesus said, I have testimony that's weightier than John's. For the very work that the Father has given me to finish, and which I am doing, testify that the Father sent me. Now, in this slide is a slide of some of the miracles of Jesus. Things like turning water into wine, and healings and calming the sea, and of all things, raising the dead. And this next slide lists more miracles of Jesus that include feeding thousands twice, casting out demons, walking on water. The Bible gives 37 miracles of Jesus that are described in detail, described in the setting and the circumstances. 37. But he did a lot more miracles than that. But in fact, if we go to the Gospel of Matthew, and you can look at this list, Matthew says it was far more than that. There were multitudes and there were masses of people coming to Jesus to be healed. Jesus was healing every disease and sickness among the people. Among large crowds, they brought all their sick and all those who touched him. All of those who touched him were healed. He healed the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and so much more. Everyone who came to Jesus to be healed was healed. Now, John says there's even more to it than that. John says Jesus did many other signs that are not recorded, many other signs. But these are written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and believing you can have life in his name. And then John supposes something. He goes, I suppose that the whole world cannot contain enough books to tell us all of the things that Jesus did. I mean, his ministry was an amazing ministry. It wasn't like Jesus was off in some remote synagogue someplace, and on a few rare occasions, he healed people. It wasn't like Jesus was curing people from the common cold, or he was jerking on someone's leg to make sure they came out the same size, or he was curing someone's headache. Jesus' miracles were signs to show who he was, that he was God on this earth in the flesh. He was the Messiah. And his miracles were like nothing we can imagine. I mean, the best I can imagine it would be if Jesus came to Baptist or Methodist hospital and he started in the intensive care unit. I mean, wouldn't this be something? And as he's going through the hospital, people are taking their IVs up and jumping out of bed and coming alive from death's doorstep. I mean, the hospital empties because Jesus walked into it. And that's how the Bible describes the miracles of Jesus. I mean, it was incredible. And when the opponents opposed Jesus, they never questioned his miracles because he did too many, too often, they couldn't be denied. They could just say things like, well, he does it on the Sabbath. Or, we don't know by whose authority he's doing these things. But they couldn't question his miracles because it was the deaf, the blind, the crippled, the demon-possessed. And everyone who came to Jesus to be healed, everyone left healed. There's never a person who went to Jesus to be healed, and they left his presence, and they were not healed. I mean, this is incredible. This is a testimony. The works of Jesus is a testimony that he is God in flesh on this earth, performing these signs and wonders that were amazing. Well, the third testimony is the testimony of the Father. Now, this is many years ago. I had a boss, and this is what he said to me. He said, Larry, I wished that I had the faith that you and your wife had. I really wished I did. I mean, I think it's such a wonderful thing, but I just can't make myself believe that stuff. Now, my boss was a person who only believed in the material realm. There was no spiritual realm. When you died, you were completely dead all over. There was nothing after that. There's no heaven, no hell, no God. Nothing. The only thing that existed was the material universe. And unfortunately, at that time and place in my life, I didn't know what to say to him. I was like, and the reason I didn't know what to say to him was because I never questioned it. I never had that struggle. I mean, I knew God was alive in my life and he was working in my life and changing my life. And I knew when I opened the Bible and read it, it was God speaking to me. I mean, I knew it. I never had to study this stuff out. I just knew it, so that was something I had to learn later. But I knew it because I had the testimony of the Father in my heart. Now here's what Jesus says. He says, "The Father who sent me has testified concerning me. You have never heard his voice nor seen his form, nor does the word dwell in you, for you do not believe in the one he sent." Now, the testimony of the Father may or may not help me reach a non-believer, but it kept me from going a bad direction because of that certainty of God working in my life. And because I had that certainty, that is a powerful testimony that Jesus is God the Son on this earth. The fourth testimony he calls is Scripture. He said, "You diligently study the Scriptures because you think that by them you possess eternal life. These are the Scriptures that testify about me, yet you refuse to come to me to have life. Do you think I will accuse you before the Father? Your accuser is Moses, of whom your hopes are set. If you believed Moses, you would have believed me, for he wrote about me. But since you do not believe what he wrote, how are you going to believe what I say?" The testimony of the Scriptures. You know, the Bible has come under attack, and we're going to talk about the Old Testament because that's the Scriptures Jesus was talking about. But the Old Testament has been under attack, saying, how can we trust the credibility of the Old Testament? How do we know it's really true and we can have confidence in the words? And you have to understand the argument, you have to go back before the days of the printing press. So if we go back before the days of the printing press, all of the copies of the Bible, these documents are called manuscripts. They were handwritten. And when a manuscript became very old and brittle because of use and age, the Jews had a special ceremony they would do to burn the scroll and to bury the remains. And because of this custom, we don't have any extremely ancient documents of the Old Testament. The oldest documents we had were 1,000 years old. Now, if you think about the time, if they're 1,000 years old, the Old Testament was written 2,500 years to 5,000 years ago. So we have this huge gap between a 1,000-year-old document and 2,500 years when it was written, and the argument was, you just have mistakes that creep into the text. People aren't perfect when they do their copies. So how can we trust the Old Testament text when we have this huge gap? I mean, we have a 1,500-year gap or more. So how can we trust the Scriptures? And in fact, things might creep in. And it was an argument that people used to destroy the credibility of the Old Testament. Now with the New Testament, it's a bit different. We have thousands of manuscripts, many thousands of the New Testament. And some of those manuscripts go very close to the original time they were written. And so the New Testament is different, but from the Old Testament, we don't have any of those very ancient documents. Well, then in November of 1946, some shepherds were throwing rocks into a cave and they heard a strange sound. And they go into the cave and they discover some jars with scrolls in them. And they took the scrolls home and they actually hung them up on a tent post as a curiosity to show their friends. And then after a while, they found there could be value in those, and so they sold them to a dealer, and they changed hands until finally they came into the hands of an archaeologist who realized their value. So he went about discovering where they were and where they came from, and we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, and these are hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts, many of them of the Old Testament. Matter of fact, huge portions of the Old Testament. Now, the one we're going to focus on is called the Great Isaiah Scroll, because it is one of the scrolls they recovered almost intact, with almost completely perfect. It's like 24 feet long, in almost perfect condition. And they could compare the Hebrew on the Isaiah scroll to scrolls that came 1,200 years later. And there's a few spelling changes and maybe punctuation and minor things, but the text was virtually unchanged. And it was astounding. I mean, we have this 1,200-year gap. And we come to these scrolls that date 200 years before the time of Jesus. And they established the credibility of the Old Testament. Jesus says, you have it, just believe what it says. Now, there's another point to make in this, is that because these scrolls predate Christianity by a couple hundred years, Christians didn't have a chance to go in there and monkey with them, right? I mean, they predate Christianity. And so when you look at the Great Isaiah Scroll, this scroll talks about the birth of the Messiah in Bethlehem. It talks about the Messiah's Galilean ministry. It talks about the healings. I mean, Isaiah, more than any other prophet, talked about this coming Messiah. And then you go to Isaiah chapter 52 and 53. And I really consider that to be the most sacred text in the Old Testament. I mean, it's almost like Isaiah was there at the foot of the cross, watching the Messiah suffer and die, and he writes about it in amazing detail. I mean, this was written by Isaiah 700 years before Jesus, and we have manuscripts that predate Jesus by a couple hundred years, and these testify that Jesus is the Messiah, he is the Christ, that the Word became flesh. So John 1 makes an astonishing claim. I mean, it's an astonishing claim that God would come to this earth in the flesh. Jesus is not just me saying this. Jesus says, look at the testimony of John the Baptist. Look at the works that I do, the miracles that I do. Look at the testimony of the Father. And look at what the scriptures say. And it truly is amazing. It truly is amazing. God coming to this earth in the flesh, in the person of Jesus, so that we can have salvation. So we're going to stop and sing a song a cappella, but the words of this song, veiled in flesh, the Godhead see. Hail the incarnate deity, pleased with us in flesh to dwell, Jesus, our Emmanuel.